Hello and welcome to another motorcycling video. For explanation here, I'm using a DJI action camera which I'm wearing in a chest harness, so that what you're going to see is more a rider's point of view than you might see in other videos. Now, if you look closely on the left hand wing mirror, you can see the other camera that I often use to make motorcycle videos. This is the same footage as I used for the last video about buying a new car and some tips that I provided for buying a new car. It's just, as I said, using the DJI action camera in the chest harness, so you're getting a rider's point of view and you can see some of the things that are happening in the dash and some of the controls rather than just, or as well as just the scenery. Now I'm going to talk about EVs in this video. I've made a lot of videos about EVs over the time that I've been making these motorcycle videos. And I want to be clear from the beginning, I don't own an EV, I don't have any shares in any company that makes, imports or sells EVs. I'm not trying to sell you a particular brand or model, and any comment that I might make about a brand or model is purely for purposes of illustrating a point, not to be considered an endorsement or a criticism of any particular EV. Also, I'm going to make very brief mention of some medical things, and I'm not a doctor, and so I'm not offering medical advice. I'm just making an observation based on things that I have heard and reported. Okay, with all that out of the way, let's get into it. So I've said from the beginning that the two reasons that anyone ought to consider buying an EV are, number one, to reduce our dependence on foreign oil. Now, we saw during the outbreak of hostilities between Iran and the USA, oil prices here spiked. There was panic buying. There were anecdotal reports of Bunnings running out of jerry cans and people turning up at the service station, filling up their car and then hauling out 2, 3 or 4 or more jerry cans and filling them all up with petrol or with fuel. So oil prices spiked and people were concerned about the supply of oil. I had quoted myself in a number of videos the claim that Australia only had 10 days of oil in reserve onshore. I was never able to confirm or verify that claim, but I repeated it nevertheless. It appears that was incorrect. In fact, the Energy Minister, Chris Bowen, I think it is, said that in fact we had something like 36 days, so 3.5 times more oil on hand or fuel on shore in reserve than what was claimed. But still people were concerned about whether we had enough oil, whether we were going to run out of oil, whether there was going to be rationing and that sort of thing. Now, prices did return fairly quickly to the pre-hostilities level, but the government nevertheless became concerned about the amount of oil we had, amount of fuel we had in reserve, and I believe that's been has now been increased to 60 days, so 6 times the claim of 10 days, and the government has been able to secure more fuel or fuel from other sources, so that should there be any further problem with tankers getting through the Straits of Hormuz, which I'm sure most people have probably never heard about until this conflict arose, that we would have a continued supply of oil and there would be no need to be concerned about rationing and so on. Nevertheless, people were concerned about that. And so anything that we can do as a nation and as individuals to reduce our dependence on foreign oil would be a good thing. If more people were to drive EVs, then obviously less people would be buying petrol. Therefore, those people who were not buying petrol would not have to worry about the price or supply of petrol. But as a nation, we would have less drain on the the oil that's arriving regularly. And when or if there was a second problem with oil supplies from the Middle East, we would have less people being concerned about supply and less concerned about the need to ration and so on. Now, the immediate situation, as I said, seems to have returned to something close to normal, but we would be foolish to think this is a one-off event. What we need our politicians to do, and our elected officials and their bureaucrats that work for them, is to plan and prepare for the worst and hope for the best. So we have to assume that there could likely be in the future further interruptions to the supply of oil from the Middle East. We could further should be aware that any interruption to supply of oil affects just about everything else that we do, because everything has to be moved from one place to another, whether it's road, rail, or air or sea. It needs fuel, and that fuel is at this stage for most people some sort of hydrocarbon. So the price of groceries all went up because items had to be moved. The price of petrol was higher, therefore the supermarkets were charging you more for groceries and so on. So we cannot be complacent and naive. We have to assume that there will be further interruptions to supply chains and want to establish supply lines. And so the less people we have depending on oil, then the better that is for our economy and the better it is for those individuals. Now, those people who say, well, EVs don't have enough range, I don't accept that that's an excuse any longer, because first of all, the average Australian drives somewhere between 35 and 40 kilometres a day. There are plenty of EVs that would allow you to do that 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or more days continuously, only needing to plug in at the end of the week, even at your own power point, and you would still have enough charge to go to the weekend sport. Even the smallest of EVs claim ranges of over 200 kilometres, and if you're just driving in the city with regenerative braking being a feature of the way you drive, you are certainly going to get that 200 kilometre range. There is an issue if you do not have off-street parking, of course, then an EV is not for you. You simply cannot park in the street and have extension cords all over the place because it's a dangerous thing. So no off-street parking, perhaps an EV is not for you at this stage. The argument about there not being enough chargers around is certainly true, but there will never be enough chargers, because when you turn up to the charging point, if there's already somebody there, you're going to say there's never enough chargers. If the charger doesn't work, you're going to say there's not enough chargers. The argument about range, as I said, is no longer, I don't think it's a credible argument any longer. And also the argument about price, I don't think is a credible argument, because if we consider that the median price, or the price bracket that's most popular for buying cars in Australia, is somewhere between $35,000 and $50,000, there are plenty of full EVs and plug-in hybrids in that price range that are in the affordable bracket, if you want, that are family oriented, that are 5 or even sometimes 7-seaters, and if they're outside the 50k, they're not too far out of it as 7-seaters, but there are plenty of vehicles in that price bracket that would meet a family's needs. So the price is no longer an issue, the range is no longer an issue. You might argue that you don't want a Chinese brand, but let's be honest about it. The reason that the Chinese brands exist is because the other makers either don't make any EVs in the first place, or they only make EVs at the high end of the market, and they left a gap in the market and the Chinese simply filled it. It wasn't that they did anything untoward. There was just a gap in the market between 35 and 50k, and the Chinese realised that they could make cars in that price range, and that's what they did. Now, the second reason that one should consider an EV is a health-related reason. You can or cannot accept the arguments about global warming and climate change and all that, and emissions and all that sort of stuff as you wish. I'm not here to argue that. I have my view about it, but I'm not here to argue it. That's entirely for you to make your own judgments and decisions about. But it is an indisputable fact that the quality of the air in the major metropolitan areas along the eastern seaboard of Australia, which is where most people live, so we're starting at Cape York and we're working our way down the east coast through Queensland, Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, around to Adelaide and so on. That's where most people live, and the quality of the air in those major population centres is not what it should be or could be. And it is equally true that many a doctor would say to a person who has a breathing issue or respiratory issue, be it asthma, emphysema or any other lung-related issue, that were they living in an area where the air was cleaner, their breathing difficulties might be less. Doesn't mean they'd be cured of their problem. If, after all, you have emphysema from smoking or something like that, going somewhere where the air is cleaner might help, but it won't cure you of the problem. So if we had cleaner air in those major cities, that would be a good thing for those people. That would be a good thing for the economy, because it would be less cost less money spent on treating their health issues, and that's good for the health system, which is equally good for the economy. Now, you might argue, well, transport doesn't produce all those much in the way of emissions and pollution. That's caused by coal-fired power stations, and that is correct. The problem with that is, first of all, there are no coal-fired power stations in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth, Darwin or Hobart or Canberra for that matter. They're all somewhere else outside of those major metropolitan areas where people live. So cleaning up the air in those cities would not have any impact on the coal-fired power stations. The coal-fired power station would not have to close down, and more people driving EVs in those major metropolitan areas would, over time, not tomorrow, not next week, maybe in a year or 2 or 5 years, would result in cleaner air in those cities, and that would produce better health outcomes for people who live in those cities who have breathing difficulties. Now, those two things on their own, for me, are reasons to consider driving an EV, especially if you live in the city and most of your driving is some sort of commuting to your work or something like that, or it's very short trips to go to the groceries or visit friends on the other side of the town or something like that. You might well argue, well, occasionally I want to go on a big long trip and an EV can't do that. There are EVs who can do that. You just have to wait a bit longer and plan your trip a little bit better so that you have recharging points and factor recharging time into your drive. Okay, so there are some thoughts about why you should consider an EV. If you have an opinion, leave it in the comment section and I'll respond to it when I become aware of it. Thanks for watching, enjoy your day, and I'll catch you in the next video, whenever that might be.